Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, displaced people in Ethiopia's Afar region say that the lack of food, shelter and medical care that they suffer because of the country's civil war is being ignored by the international humanitarian community. Little aids come through as conversations centre on the neighbouring region of Tigray, which is also badly hit. Also, as investment in startups worldwide stagnate or drops off, African innovation continues to excite. The region's bucked a global trend, and funding for startups have doubled in the first half of this year. And hitting the high notes, a Togolese soprano mixes Western classical opera and traditional African rhythms in unique performances that celebrate both creative heritages. Clémentine Ayéfouni is her country's greatest operatic soloist. But first, the US envoy in Ethiopia has called on the country to allow the embattled region of Tigray more access to fuel so that humanitarian aid stuck in warehouses can be distributed to communities desperate for food. Ethiopia has previously denied claims of a fuel shortage in the northern region. It's been at the heart of a civil war with the federal government since late 2020. The conflict sparked severe humanitarian crises, and not all in Tigray. In the neighbouring region of Afar, many displaced people say that their plight has been ignored in international conversations about how to get help to Ethiopia's war-stricken communities. Laurent Berstecker has more.
From their makeshift roadside camp, families longingly glance at the convoys passing them by. These trucks are all filled to the brink with food aid, destined for war-ravaged Tigray. But none are stopping here in Ethiopia's Afar region, where hunger and drought increasingly loom.
Trucks carrying aid for Tigray pass here. What about us? What have we done wrong? Why is no aid coming here? We are also starving.
The northeastern Afar region hasn't been spared by Ethiopia's bloody conflict. Many of these families fled their villages nearly 2 years ago after they were attacked by TPLF fighters. Since then, they say they've been abandoned by the government and the international community. But the UN's World Food Programme has denied focusing its efforts on Tigray alone and says it hasn't neglected the Afar region.
I can assure you, WFP, we have continuously continued distributing, delivering food to Afar.
Since TPLF forces retreated from Afar in April, Ethiopian authorities have been calling on displaced persons to return home, promising them food and financial aid. But these families say they're still waiting for the promised support as they continue to watch the trucks pass by.
Well, as funding for startups across the world decreases because of the blow to investor confidence caused by inflation, the war in Ukraine, and the fallout from the pandemic, one region has bucked the trend. New research suggests that funding for startups doubled in Africa for the first 6 months of this year. And that prior to that, there had already been steady growth and investment in African tech companies in particular. Sam Bradpeace in Dakar tells us more about what's behind the continent's success on this front.
"2022 has been a boom year when it comes to the funding of startups on the African continent. In the first 6 months of 2022, African startups raised $3.14 billion. That's more than twice the amount raised during the same period in 2021. At this rate, 2022 will become a record year for the raising of capital for startups in Africa. Market analysts attribute this to various things, including the fact that many African populations are young, dynamic and digitally savvy, all of which creates the perfect kind of ecosystem for tech startups in particular to arise. Now, when it comes to the regional breakdown, West Africa attracts the biggest portion of startup investment on the continent, with Nigeria certainly being the most important player. But it must be said that there have been success stories here in Senegal as well. Last year, Wave, which is a mobile money service, became the first startup in Francophone Africa to be valued at more than $1 billion. something which in the industry is known as unicorn status.
That report there from Sam Bradpiece for us. Now, DR Congo has asked the spokesman for the UN's MONUSCO mission in the country to leave. Kinshasa has written to MONUSCO blaming Matthias Gilman for much of the recent tension that's driven sometimes deadly anti-UN protests in the country. Its government has accused him of making indelicate and inopportune statements and said that he compromises trust between the country and the United Nations. Kinshasa hasn't pointed to any specific statements from Gilman. At least 36 people have been killed in recent demonstrations against MONUSCO. The findings of an investigation into widespread corruption in connection to South African state assets have led the UK government to ban the consultancy giant Bain and Company from UK government contracts for 3 years. The US company had been hired by Pretoria in 2015, and investigators eventually found that Bain colluded with ex-South African President Jacob Zuma to undermine his country's tax service. The contract between Bain and South Africa was allegedly worth more than $9 million. The British government backed off Bain because of the company's failure to clarify the circumstances of its involvement in the corruption scandal that's been dubbed state capture. In Nigeria, 2 airlines have recently had their operations suspended indefinitely, one for inability to maintain its fleet, the other because of several major breakdowns during flights. After the domestic flight sector enjoyed years of impressive expansion, the country's aviation sector is now doing less well. Most recently, it suffered a further blow from the crippling rise in the price of fuel, known as Jet A1. Our correspondents report.
This plane will be able to take off again after recently landing in Lagos. Its operations team has sourced the precious aviation fuel. Nigeria imports most of its refined petroleum. Because of the war in Ukraine, prices have tripled since February and airlines are facing uncertainty.
Upon the scarcity it is, most times it delays the flight, but we don't have choice to go and look for the fuel.
Over the past 20 years, domestic flights have grown rapidly in Nigeria, from 8 to 20 million passengers per year. Nearly 10 companies compete in this local market. But the cost of aircraft maintenance plus the explosion in fuel prices are weakening air operators. Almost all claim to be flying at a loss.
If we continue to fly this way, at 90% cost of aviation, then you will have little or nothing to take care of other things that are related to keeping the aircraft safe in there. So we're afraid.
Average ticket prices have increased by 70% in less than 6 months. Some Nigerians say they'll keep flying even if they have to travel less frequently. This passenger on a Lagos-Abuja flight cannot imagine journeying by bus because of the highway insecurity.
Using the flights for now is better because the roads are not safe. So no matter how expensive it is, we'll just struggle and then come. We know that it's not easy, but we've been doing it. We'll still continue to do because we all want to live.
The question of survival is also one for many Nigerian aviation companies, because the price of Jet A1 fuel continues to soar without limit.
Clémentine Ayéfouni is her country's greatest operatic soloist. But despite decades at the top of her game, the Togolese singers had to make a lot of adaptations to forge a career in a country where her musical genre of choice isn't widely known. But that's never dampened her determination. Our team went to meet her.
Clémentine Ayéfouni has a voice that soars. The Togolese soprano sings operatic classics like Mozart's Magic Flute or Verdi's Traviata with passion and precision.
When I first started performing classical solos in my choir, some people would laugh at me. They would say, "Where is this going to take you?" Today, the public understands more and more that our efforts are not in vain. Many people are beginning to take an interest in classical opera, even though we still have a long way to go.
Togo doesn't have any opera conservatories, so the virtuoso teaches classical opera to church singers herself.
There is not enough guidance to help us young people to reach the level of musical professionalism required to make a career out of it.
The choir usually only learns religious songs to be performed at Mass. Clémentine tries to broaden the repertoire and technique.
I started off in the choir, but it turns out that choir songs do not develop into the classical range. So from time to time, we schedule exercises and for my performances as well, before I come on stage.
Classical opera still has a relatively small footprint across Africa. That's left space for Clémentine Ayéfouni to experiment, and she often weaves traditionally African elements into her operatic performances.
We have to be able to express ourselves in our language. That's why we added a little Afro music to classical music.
Togo's greatest operatic soloist has so far had a 30-year career. As she continues to construct her legacy, she hopes to one day reach the heights of Jessie Norman, one of the most renowned operatic sopranos of the last 50 years.
Good stuff. Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Till then, take care.